Blessings, beloveds. Let's talk about Mercury ingressing into Virgo. So let me just bring up the current chart for today. Okay, so 11th of August, Southern Hemisphere, 10th of August, Northern Hemisphere. So you can see there's Mercury at 28 degrees of Leo at the moment. Okay, there's Mercury there. Now, Mercury is going to really fly actually through Virgo, and let me just show you what that's going to look like. It's going to make some pretty significant aspects, which is what I want to kind of talk about today. But first of all, before I start sort of unpacking, some of the possible manifestations and directions of Mercury in Virgo, relative to your own chart at least, it's important to pay attention to, well, where is Virgo in your birth chart? Because that's the house that Mercury is going to be transiting through, obviously. Now, Mercury moves very quickly, and I don't normally do, a podcast or a video for every sign that Mercury ingresses into, but I felt it to be important at the moment, relative, of course, to the nature of events as we can see them unfolding, where everything is amplifying by virtually by the minute, but certainly amplifying on a daily basis. And Mercury in Virgo is its rulership placement. I think it's going to speak to very important developments over the next couple of weeks because of this particular sign that it's actually transiting. And yeah, I've chosen to spoke about it because I think it's going to be a very important ingress relative to Mercury, which basically corresponds to our thinking, obviously, left linear mind, and just all the information that's out there on the collective ether that's been transmitted through a number of different platforms, through a number of different people, worldwide in so many different ways. So pay attention to the house that Mercury is transiting for you, because on a personal level, you can actually think about Mercury in Virgo, what it means in Virgo, but relative to yourself and your own chart. And, really in very simple terms, wherever Mercury is transiting, it's just pointing to where your mind is, well, one could say very focused during this time. It's what you're going to be giving a lot of thought to. So obviously each house it transits has different levels of meaning, different levels of life are activated, if you like, and different levels of focus being, drawn to during this time. So it'll have that personal touch relative to where it's moving in your own chart. But on a collective basis, it is going to speak to the bigger picture of everything that's going on in the world. And let's not forget, we are in a global situation which corresponds to health. And of course, Virgo, which is ruled by Mercury, which rules the sixth house in the birth chart, is largely to do with health, mind-body connection or disconnection, service, our everyday rituals and routines, the crisis that we face and how we need to navigate our way through that, the adjustments we need to make, the changes we need to make, the attention we need to pay towards that area of life, and so forth. And, Virgo, as I have said many, many times, is really one of the more complex signs in the entire zodiac. And that's because when you understand the zodiac from Aries going right through to Pisces, so the 12 zodiac signs, there's a developmental process of self, ego, body, which is forming and developing into a human being, the holistic view of a human being and a soul. And when we reach Virgo, it's crisis time, because Virgo is the sign that follows Leo, and Leo is the point in the zodiac where we've reached a level of, at best, self-actualization, the ability to express, radiate our beingness, express who we are with confidence and courage, and many other things, of course, as well. But when we get to Virgo, there's a very good analogy that Jeffrey Wolf Green uses, which depicts, it's kind of like a pyramid, if you can imagine a pyramid, and Leo sort of sits at the top of the pyramid, which is pointing to the ego being developed in full form, you could say. And Virgo sits at the bottom of the pyramid because it's actually pointing to how we now have to step down off our grandiose ego and now start to really examine, okay, where do I further need to improve on myself? So there's that whole theme that is activated when we are working with Virgo energies, the Virgo archetype. And it brings up crisis and critical experiences and developments, because Virgo, relative to Aries, the beginning of the zodiac, the distance between them is 150 degrees, which is the inconjunct aspect. And the inconjunct aspect, regardless of whatever bodies we are talking about or signs in the zodiac, it basically points to the crisis that we meet from the point of view of seeing where we further need to improve and develop on ourselves. So anything to do with Virgo really just has a nature about it that does bring up critical themes and crisis. So Virgo is a feminine yin sign, a mutable sign, ruled by Mercury, which corresponds to the mental processes, but the mental processes operating on an internal and inner level, because it is a yin feminine sign, and the yin and feminine is always activated internally, operating, processing internally. So matters of critical reasoning skills, which I've spoken about quite extensively the last couple of weeks, the importance of that, critical self-analysis, introspection, discernment, crisis, self-improvement, service, discipline, health. These are all matters that correspond to the archetype of Virgo. So this is going to be a critical time for the world, really, just from the level of what's actually taking place in health organizations, CDC, you name it, just every single body that corresponds to health, GPs, the whole spectrum are really going to be influenced by this energy. The really positive thing about Mercury in Virgo is that because of the nature of the yin feminine quality, which takes us inside ourselves to actually do some self-analysis and introspection, it really places us, if you like, in an opportunity to really critically assess our own thinking, the choices we are making or the choices we are considering to make, the consequences to those choices, the overall mental outlook and perception we have on things, but from a really critical mental space within. So I see that as a real positive, actually, for all of us. moving out of Mercury, moving, out of Leo is it's a very interesting transition, moving out of Leo energy into Virgo. And I will be talking a lot about this as we get closer to Virgo season, just to use a popular term, if you like, relative to the sun's ingress into the different signs every month. And so we can see that, the sun is at 18 degrees of Leo. So, coming towards 23rd of August, around there, the sun's going to ingress into Virgo. And so I will have a lot of things to say about that, particularly, again, because of the nature of events, and particularly because the sun is also going to form an opposition to Neptune, as is Mercury as well. So some of the major aspects that we can discuss and be aware of are these. So let's just move forward. Now you can see there's Mercury in Virgo. So it gets there by the 11th of August. Okay, if I fiddled around with hours there, it'll take us back to the 11th of August, and it would be in Virgo. So as we continue to move forward, there's quite a few interesting aspects that are going to be formed. So let me just show you. There's more than what I'm going to speak about today, but I've just chosen or selected a handful of them that I think are worth noting. Okay, so by the 16th of August, Mercury is at 7 degrees of Virgo. And the most powerful aspect on this day is the square to the transiting south and north nodes. We know these south and north nodes in Sagittarius and Gemini have been incredibly powerful for the events that we are experiencing and witnessing relative to truth and information, and the complete and utter confusion around what is actually truth about the information that is being transmitted on a global level. So I think Mercury forming a square to the nodes is a pretty significant time relative, again, to what is truth, what are the old belief systems that we've been holding on to that are integrated and imprinted in our psyche that need to be discarded, where we do need to integrate new information, Gemini. But with Mercury in Virgo squaring this axis, it's a T square, isn't it? It's basically forming a T square. So that's a point of conflict or resistance. However, the positive thing about this is that Mercury is in Virgo, and it gives us the ability to discern truth, to discern facts, and to not just be spoon-fed transmissions that are not accurate. We must use our own inner critical reasoning skills. Mercury gives us that gift to be able to do that. Anyway, I think something very significant will come through, will be transmitted through perhaps numerous platforms, as a matter of fact. I mean, as it stands at the moment, I know it's impossible for me to cover, what's happening in every single country. So I just tend to speak sort of relatively broadly to an extent, and sometimes I'll point to perhaps certain things that are occurring in Australia because that's my current location. And I often point to some things that are happening in USA and Europe to an extent, as best as I can, at least anyway. So at the moment, without going into too much detail, as I've mentioned previously, Melbourne went into its sixth lockdown, number 6, about less than a week ago. And the justification for that lockdown was based on false information, as per what's been leaked just yesterday. So the politician who made that decision and put 6.5 million people down in lockdown is now being confronted with the misinformation he's given, and he's been asked to produce the truth of actually what's taken place. So anyway, long story short, he lied about information which he's admitted himself, and he's putting it in the context of I made an error, but it was actually a lie. And so anyway, that's an example of that first of all, the Neptune in Pisces, which has been squaring these nodes. Even though the nodes have moved away from the Neptune, it's still all there in the picture. But the point is, I think that politicians and people of authority and power who in truth have a duty of care and a duty of responsibility to humanity and to communities and systems and you name it, are being further exposed and challenged and confronted because of the amount of whistleblowers and the amount of people doing their homework and research. And so it's not as easy for them to get away with their lies as it has been previously. Now, someone made a comment underneath my previous video about Uranus and Saturn and said, and rightly so, and I agreed with this, that, there are people in the consensus reality dimension that belong to the scientific field or the medical field that are actually trying to do the honest thing and that are trying to do the right thing for the world and humanity. And I absolutely agree, but they're far and few between. And so that is just how it is. So the Mercury squaring the nodes, I think, is going to bring up more exposure of what needs to be critically assessed and critically analysed, so that people are actually better informed and informed with actual truth and facts, as opposed to the opposite to that. So as we proceed forward, Mercury is also going to form a square. Sorry, actually the square was first, so let me just go back. So around about here, so the day before Mercury squares the nodes, it's going to also square Ceres. And I think that's going to be a very important day, a very important aspect. And I've spoken about Ceres in Gemini. You can watch that video. It's available on my YouTube channel if you haven't watched it and you're interested in hearing about that, because that's a very crucial archetype that is speaking to, again, our own ability to question and seek the truth to the questions that we ask. Now, Mercury squaring Ceres is going to bring up something significant, possibly something quite difficult again. But on the other hand, it could also be speaking to the fact that, well, I mean, I see it as possibly perhaps certain people who have followed through on specific information they have been given ends up being a situation where they find out that, well, now I have more information on this, now I understand more about this, and I wish I had have waited, or I wish I had have looked further, or I wish I had have asked more questions, and so on and so forth. So there's going to be a sense of loss. Ceres always brings up loss and grief. with the hope of renewal and transformation as well. But certainly what typically surfaces, at least to begin with, is a sense of loss and grief. And what is the loss and grief about here? It's about the information that's been transmitted. So I think that's going to be an important day as well. Then the most significant aspect after this is going to be Mercury forming a conjunction to Hygeia. There's Hygeia right next to Mercury, that little black sort of symbol with what looks like kind of antennas or horns or whatever you want to call them. Anyway, that's the symbol for Hygeia. So Mercury is approaching Hygeia. Now, I think this is going to be huge, absolutely huge, because Hygeia is the goddess of health and hygiene. Mercury forming a conjunction to Hygeia is actually suggesting that some very important news, knowledge, information is going to be transmitted about the global health situation. And it is going to come through Virgo, which is really going into deep analysis and discernment and critical analysis of actually what is going on. Right? So I see this as a positive. For some people, it might not be so positive because it might depend on the choices that they have made thus far as well. So it's just going to depend on who we are, where we stand, the choices we've made thus far, and so forth. But regardless of that, whatever position we take, wherever we are standing, that's what this energy is going to point to. It's going to really bring about some new information that's going to be quite significant about the global health situation. As Mercury proceeds forward, then it's going to make a conjunction to Mars, which is around the 19th of August. Now, this is going to be an interesting little number, and this can be quite an aggravating energy because it's Mars. So we kind of need to watch this period around here, just even in our own personal lives, from the point of view of how and what we are communicating. What is the real motivation and intention behind what we are actually communicating? Because Mars, Mercury can be impulsive words, communication, fueled through distressing feelings or thoughts where we might otherwise not communicate in that way, and we might later regret what we say. So there is a little bit of that. On the other hand, the flip side to that coin, of course, is the courage to speak up, the courage to communicate, and the courage to actually really critically analyze and assess the information that's been put before you with the dose of courage, Mars. So it has, everything has a dual side. It just depends who we are, what's going on, how we tune into that energy, and how we express and integrate and experience that energy. Okay, so virtually at the same time, there is also Mercury's forming and in conjunct to Chiron in Aries. Now, I see this as being very significant as well. It's happening on the same day as Mars being conjunct Mercury. So some matters here around, again, probably around health, and perhaps where some people might feel hurt in some kind of way through what's being communicated to them, through what they're allowing in their own mental field and processes. Chiron typically does bring up what can really trigger deep wounds inside us. or wounds that are actually there and it's just the trigger point. It can also be a sense of feeling rejected. So it is an inconjunct aspect. So it does mean some kind of inner, because Mercury is in Virgo, some kind of inner adjustment relative to our own thinking and words as well, from the point of view of Chiron's position, which is, do we want to communicate logically and rationally, having critically assessed what we are thinking and presenting, or do we want to just spit, arrows of poison? So just something to think about there. Okay, as we proceed forward, Mercury forms a trine to Uranus. I really like this aspect. Interesting, actually. Let me just see something. So the trine to Uranus is just during the time where Uranus stops. That's why the S is there. It's stopping to go retrograde. So it's stationary retrograde at this time. That actually means this energy is a real hot spot at this time. It's a very I see it as quite an intense sort of amplified energy. It's sort of imagine kind of, the wheels, things just moving, then suddenly everything just comes to a stop, dead standstill. There's potent energy in that ground of where things have come to a standstill. So a trine, of course, implies energies flowing together, working harmoniously together, being supported, because it's earth to earth. Taurus is trine Virgo. So Mercury trine Uranus, I see that as a really important breakthrough, because Uranus rules breakthroughs, a breakthrough of information that could be very powerful for the entire human race. About what? About health, about the global situation. So just watch those days, 19th, 20th, 21st of August. I would say that there could be absolutely some very important breakthrough that is transmitted that actually is positive, because Uranus is about liberation and freedom. It's about breaking down conditioned ways of being, thinking, living, expressing. So the information, Mercury in Virgo, health, that's going to come through is going to act as some kind of breakthrough for all of us in a positive way, because it is a trine aspect. So that's I can't wait to see what that brings up. I feel that's a real positive implication there. And finally, well, not finally, it will be finally in a minute, but just before we go to finally, what happens is when Mercury reaches 22 degrees of Virgo, there is an opposition to Neptune. Now that's really tricky. I've said this before. In my observations, just about every politician that I've looked at has a Mercury-Neptune aspect, particularly a hard aspect such as a conjunction, square, or opposition. It seems to be the signature, which is quite uncanny. It's not a coincidence, is it? So anyway, relative to the collective picture, Mercury opposite Neptune at the personality level, of course, brings up matters of confusion, incorrect information, deliberate deception, and having the wool pulled over your eyes, to be quite frank. On the other hand, at a positive level, and just before I explain that, let me just read this about Mercury in Virgo. So one of the things to always consider about Virgo, regardless of which planet we are talking about, this is a primary theme of Virgo, and certainly the planet is going to add a description, a further description of this Virgo theme. So Virgo learns about the nature of its reality through crisis. Crisis leads to analysis, which leads to reflection. This is why Virgo endlessly analyzes. At some point, analysis and crisis will produce self-knowledge through pain. So that's just an interesting statement to consider when you're thinking about working with the archetype of Virgo. Now, relative to Mercury being opposite Neptune, as I said, there can be incredible, the other thing, it can be disappointment, because Neptune, we absolutely 100% corresponds to disappointment. So yes, it corresponds to all the beautiful things of love, spirit, unity, unconditional love, dreams, connecting to, pardon me, to spirit and spiritual things, and, spiritual practices, and aligning with the divine will, and so on and so forth. Of course, it always is those things as well. But a Mercury Neptune aspect, especially in opposition, which means a polarized energy, the Neptune gets projected onto the external situations. So I would say that on these days here, around 24th, 25th, 26th, you could say around there, be very careful with what you are hearing, what you are transmitting, and what you are believing. And if it comes down to having to have to make a really important decision about your life circumstances, in whichever way that may be, I would say wait until this transit passes before you do so. On a more evolved level, let's say, the Mercury opposite Neptune can be a beautiful thing from the point of view of Mercury in Virgo helps us question, analyze, discern, get the matter of facts right, probe, critically assess, and so forth. Keeps us very grounded in that way. And then the Neptune it will ultimately want to transcend and take that Mercury into what we could say is a more holistic sense of our own perceptions, our own thinking of who we are, our own thinking of life, the world, source, everything. Here's a comment that I want to read. Pisces, which is the polarity to Virgo, of course, and you can think about this statement relative to your Virgo Pisces axis in your chart, and particularly if you have planets in those archetypes. Pisces facilitates the development of the holistic, intuitive approach to life to counter Mercury's left-brained logical orientation. Becoming aware of the connection to divinity fosters self-forgiveness and appreciation of the imperfections in others. The holistic view helps develop inner peace that puts the worrying mind at rest. I really love that particular comment, especially as we are looking at Mercury in Virgo, because even though Mercury in Virgo, has the ability to operate in all the ways that I've discussed so far, it does also have that nervousness, that nervous sort of place in its thought patterns and thought processes. And, that can be quite anxiety provoking. That can bring up a lot of restlessness. It's a mutable force. Mutable energy is always about movement, and mutable energy is the one energy that can really activate, if you like, restlessness and difficulty to anchor and ground ourselves. Not so much in Virgo, that would be more Gemini. That would get that end of the stick to that extent. But nevertheless, Mercury in Virgo, Virgo is a mutable sign. So because of the nature of wanting to probe and break everything down in order to see why and how it works and understand it better, there's a lot of energy that goes into those kinds of processes. So, it is important to observe that in ourselves as well, and not get too caught up in just critical judgment either of ourselves or others, because that's the downside to Virgo. It can be, on the upside, it's wonderful at critical analysis and assessment, but on the downside, it can be so damn judgmental and so unforgiving. And that's where its polarity, Pisces, when that is integrated, it really enables for that holistic energy of that access to shine through, which Pisces is what helps Virgo to open its heart, to be more forgiving, more empathetic, and far less judgmental. But every sign in the zodiac, of course, is absolutely wonderful, absolutely crucial, and has its dual sort of nature, if you like, in the sense that there is a personality level and there is a higher level, more evolved level of every single archetype. So when we are looking at any archetype, it's always, if you can always have this in the back of your mind, when you're looking at a planet transiting through a particular sign, always keep in mind the polarity, because that's the most powerful thing to think about from the point of view of integration and holistic integration, drawing in a balance of these polarities, enabling them to be working together as opposed to being split off. When they are split off, then we are only identifying with one and we are projecting the other. That's splitting off. We've what's the word? I've just forgotten this word I was trying to come up with. Never mind. But when we are split off with an energy, an archetype, usually what that means is very unconscious within us. And the most typical response to that is to project it outside of ourselves. And so for integration to occur, we need to recognize all the archetypes inside us. So the final aspect, of course, is with Mercury in Virgo, is a trine to Pluto, and I absolutely love that. Absolutely love that. That is happening around, I leave an orb of about 3 days. So the approaching, the exactness, and then the aspect sort of, in this case, Mercury moving away from the trine. And I see that as the exact date is the exact date, but there's an orb of that energy building up. It gets to the exactness and then it starts moving away. Typically with fast moving planets such as Mercury, this is happening over a 2-3 day window. That's the kind of orb that I allow for these sorts of transits. So Mercury trine Pluto is, I see that as a real positive again, because that could actually be the indicator of everything else that Mercury went through in this journey, from the point of when it started its ingress into Virgo, which was the square to the nodes, to Ceres, conjunction to Hygeia, trine to Uranus, opposition to Neptune. Everything that transpires through that, with Mercury closing off its cycle in Virgo and forming its last aspect to Pluto, which is a trine, is indicative of a positive level of transformation that can occur in our own mental analytical processes. So it could mean that things that we have been able to understand better, to be more clear about breakthroughs that might come through with the Uranus trine at the closure of this cycle of Mercury in Virgo. We can now actually evolve in some kind of way with our thinking. So that's a really powerful transit for Mercury to complete his cycle in Virgo. I absolutely love that. So during this time, Venus ingressed into Libra. That actually took place on the 16th of August. And I will come back, hopefully, and do another separate podcast for that, because I love talking about the goddess. You know, she's really the light. You know, she's this beautiful body of light reflecting, you know, so much love. It's just so important to really be tuned into her as much as we can be, you know, on a daily basis. Really, she's always offering gifts. Venus rules gifts, so you know, she's the gift of love and light, and it's really worthwhile always paying attention to her. Okay, guys, I will leave it here. I hope this was useful and helpful. And again, you know, thank you so much for your comments and all your beautiful, you know, love and feedback and thoughts. And, you know, I appreciate all of you very, very much. I thank you for taking the time to listen, and I'll see you guys very soon. Sending you all much love. Take care.